you have to get the context. We all look at where we are now, 25 years into an epidemic, and we forget just how dark the times were in 1985, 1986, 1987. In 1985, in the Castro, just the Castro neighborhood, 10 blocks, 1,000 people had died. And almost everyone was caring for someone. And Cleve Jones, who organizes the Candlelight March every year for George Moscone and Harvey Milk, was fed up with people not being public and this staying in the shadows with so much stigma and phobia. And so he asked people who were going to march in the Candlelight March to make a simple sign with the name of someone they knew. And when the march got down to the Federal Building, they pulled out all the signs and they taped them on the front of the building. And stepping back from it, it looked like a giant crazy quilt where each of the pieces are different colors and randomly sewn in. And for Cleve and people standing around him, the thought of a quilt kind of summed up everything that was wrong in how the country was responding. When you hear the word quilt, you think of your grandmother taking care of you when you're sick. And that was so far from the way our culture and our society was responding to people with AIDS, who were being left to die in hospital corridors, who were being written off by their families and thrown out of their apartments. And Cleve thought this might be a way to help people break through and build some bridges. The March on Washington in 1987 was about a year later, and Cleve had come to me and asked, explain this idea for a quilt. And I did think it was a little bit crazy, but I said I would help. And we made some decisions then about what the quilt would look like and how it would operate. And I think, although Cleve doesn't say it today, I think we were all thinking this was something we were going to put our souls and energy into for 3 or 4 months, to take this AIDS quilt that was more of a protest banner to Washington and lay it down at the feet of the government and demand action. And then something would happen and we would go on and do other things. So it was that June of 1987, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, that we put up some signs around the Castro that said volunteers needed, come to a meeting. And Gert showed up with some friends and 2 panels that she'd already made. And we were kind of off to the races.
And that's a good segue to Gert. So, Gert, you've been involved since the first summer of the quilt, 1987. Right. How did you hear about it, and what brought you into, what made you, inspired you to make those first 2 panels? And which were your first 2 panels?
Okay, well, my first 2 panels were for Roger Lyon and, David Calgero. And when I first heard about the Names Project, I was at a party, and I had been working and going to hospitals, not working in hospitals, but going there and helping and trying to keep people happy and stuff. And I was trying to find something to do, but I couldn't go to the hospitals anymore. So somebody just happened to know Cleve, and they said, you know, I think you should call him. I think he's doing something with some sewing and stuff. And I called him in April of '87 when I was headed off to New York. And he goes, how did you hear about this? And anyway, so he kind of explained it to me, and I went off, and as I was on the plane, drew him and worked on him for about 6 weeks, and that's why I had him ready for the first meeting. What made me come into it is that all my friends were dying, and I was losing my mind, and I needed something to do, and I always made presents for my friends, so it was another way of kind of making presents for them. And I was really pissed and angry, and I saw this as a way to, I heard it more like we were going to lay down our dead in front of the White House, and I was all for that, you know. And like he said, I wrote my address on mine because I thought, oh, you know, these queens, I don't know what they'll do with these panels.
And when this all goes to hell, I want my panel back.
I wanted my panels back, yeah. And so we thought we'd go save the world, and that would be it. La la, you know.
Here we still are.
In the midst of our chatting and, you know, my meeting your roommate, Jeff, for the first time, you started to tell us about this idea. And in fact, I think you related the story almost exactly the way you just did, which is with, you know, a lot of eloquence and energy and understanding about what the potential power of the project could be if we were to create something and could lay it at the feet of all of these members of government who seemed like they were doing not a damn thing for us. And at that time, I was a journalist. I was working for a newspaper, and we had a relatively brief introduction to the idea, it was a couple of months later, I was walking down the street and saw that there was already a workshop on Market Street. And we opened the door, and there was Mike. He was already doing his thing. And Gert, you were probably already there doing your thing too, but I didn't meet you immediately. And in the midst of that re-meeting, you did the volunteer thing, which is, now what do? You were a journalist? We need somebody who could write a press release. We need somebody who could, and then, next thing you know, you're involved. That was Mike.
No, that's exactly how it happened. People gravitated to the Market Street workshop. It was like this unstoppable force drawing people there. A lot of them didn't even know what they were going to do or why they were going, but it was an unstoppable force. And somehow people sussed out their individual talents and skills, and they were put to work in various places, whether they could sew or not.